Bill Gaither had been telling the story of Because He Lives for close to 50 years when something unexpected broke through. Not the polished version gospel music had come to expect from him, not the testimony shaped for Sunday mornings and homecoming stages, but something rawer and slower and more privately carried than anything he had put on camera before. The question that opened it up was ordinary. His answer was not. Gospel music has produced its share of iconic songwriting partnerships, but the collaboration between Bill and Gloria Gaither sits in its own category entirely. From small rural congregations in Indiana to packed arenas and living rooms across the country, their songs became the soundtrack to the moments people could not get through alone. Funerals, hospital rooms, Wednesday night prayer meetings where the coffee was bad and the grief was real. Bill's voice and presence on the Gaither Homecoming stages carried a particular weight over the decades, something closer to a pastor than a performer, a man who seemed to have already walked through whatever valley the person watching him was still inside. That impression was not wrong. What it left out is what this video is about. To understand what he was actually carrying, the story has to go back to 1970 and 1971, and not just to the well-known version of those years. Bill was teaching school full-time while managing a Christian music career that kept expanding faster than his emotional reserves could support. And somewhere inside that grind, something shifted in a way that went deeper than fatigue. He has used the word depression in interviews over the years. Gloria has used it too. But the clinical label has always been a container for something more specific. A confrontation with doubt, a slow erosion of the settled certainty his public life projected. A period in which the man writing songs about resurrection was privately wrestling with whether he still believed what he was singing. Gloria was pregnant with their third child, Benjamin, and the song that would define their ministry for the next half-century grew directly out of that darkness. Because He Lives was not written from a place of peace. Gloria said it plainly, and Bill echoed it across multiple conversations. The song was an act of will, a declaration made against despair rather than from inside it. What the public version of that story always had was a clean resolution. The valley, the song, the light on the other side. And by the mid-1970s, as the song spread through congregations faster than anyone could track, the culture around Bill had already built that narrative into something tidy, a completed testimony with a beginning and an end and a bow tied around it. The problem with that framing is one that anyone who has actually lived through a serious crisis of faith or identity understands. The resolution is rarely as clean in the living as it is in the telling. The 2019 interview was filmed as part of a longer archival conversation, the kind of setting Bill had navigated hundreds of times across his career in evangelical Christianity. The question put to him was familiar enough on its surface, asking him to revisit the writing of Because He Lives. He began with the version people knew, and then he stopped, looked away from the camera, and when he spoke again, what came out was something the people in that room had not heard him say in that form or with that weight behind it. Bill said that during the worst of that period, he had not told Gloria how far down he had actually gone. Not to deceive her, but because he was afraid. Afraid that the full depth of what he was feeling, the doubt, the exhaustion that had curdled into something darker, the creeping awareness that he had been performing a faith he no longer fully felt, would be more than a young marriage could hold. He told himself he was protecting her, and he believed that for a long time. What he acknowledged next arrived with tears that came slowly rather than all at once. A private room had existed inside their partnership for years, locked from the inside. and Gloria could feel the shape of it without being able to enter. He said, with visible effort, that he was not certain he had ever fully opened that door for her. Not in 40 years of marriage. Not until late. Gloria, in a separate conversation that is circulated among people who follow the Gaither ministry closely, was asked whether she knew how deep that season had gone for Bill. Her answer carried the particular honesty that long marriages produce when the people inside them stop performing for each other. She knew something was there. She could feel the weight of what he wasn't bringing into the room with him, and she named Bill's tendency to carry heavy things alone as both a strength and a sorrow in the same breath, without bitterness, with the kind of acceptance that only arrives after decades of choosing someone completely, rather than just the parts they are willing to show you. What undid Bill in that interview was not the depression itself, and that distinction matters. What broke through was the recognition, arriving in his 80s, that the silence he had chosen and called protection had also been a wall. Gloria, the woman who had given the most precise language to his deepest interior life across 50 years of co-writing in contemporary Christian music, had deserved to stand on the other side of that wall with him, and he had not always let her through. Older men, when they finally say the true thing, tend not to weep dramatically. Bill wept the way they do, quietly, without performance, in the register of someone who has stopped managing the impression he leaves and started simply telling the truth. For anyone who has spent time with the Gaither Homecoming series, that moment lands differently than any concert footage could. The Homecoming videos, more than 130 titles released across 3 decades of Christian television, built their reputation on a particular atmosphere. Unhurried, familial, warm in a way that felt unlike anything else in the gospel music world. Artists who gathered in Bill's Indiana studio in 1991 were not there to record or perform in any formal sense. They were there to sing together in a room, and what happened inside that room became one of the best-selling video franchises in Christian retail history. Guy Penrod, David Phelps, Wes Hampton, Mark Lowry, and dozens more found audiences through those recordings that they might never have reached otherwise. But the atmosphere Bill built into that project, that specific quality of welcome and unhurried grace, looks different once you know what he had been privately carrying. Michael English, whose fall from the height of contemporary Christian music in the early 1990s was swift and public and painful, has spoken with deep emotion about the phone call that came from Bill almost immediately, not after a waiting period, and not once English had proven himself sufficiently restored, but right away, with a seat on the Homecoming stage and a clear message that the story was not finished. Russ Taff, whose battle with alcoholism and the long shadow of a painful childhood took decades to fully surface, has said in interviews that Bill built something in the Homecoming world that was different from every other room in gospel music. A space where people carrying things could carry them among friends rather than alone. Whether Bill reached consciously into his own experience of isolation when he constructed that atmosphere is something only he can fully answer. But the connection runs close to the surface once you know what you are looking for. The man who had kept a locked room inside himself for 40 years built a ministry that was, in its bones, about opening doors. Gloria's writing in the later years carries a different register than the work she produced in the busy middle decades of their ministry together. More wilderness in it, more honest accounting of what a long marriage actually feels like from the inside, the ways two people who love each other completely can still at times be strangers to each other's interior weather. She has not named Bill's moment on camera in terms that would make it a headline, But she has written in her own voice and with her own precision about grace that arrives late, about gifts wrapped in years of waiting, about how the most important conversation in a marriage is sometimes the one that takes the longest to begin. People close to the Gaithers say what changed between them after that period of fuller honesty was not dramatic, because long marriages rarely transform in dramatic ways. What shifted was quieter, a softness in the space between them, a willingness on both sides to let the other one be seen more completely. The kind of change that does not make headlines, but that everyone who spends time around them can feel. The song that defined a ministry was born from a darkness that was only partially shared. And the sharing, incomplete as it was, still produced something that carried millions of people through their own valleys across more than 50 years of devotional music and worship. What that says about the distance between what we feel and what we are finally able to give does not have a clean answer. And Bill Gaither does not offer one. What he offered instead was something rarer. The willingness, at an age when most men find it easier to leave the complicated things unsaid, to say them on camera in a room with other people watching. Men who have spent their lives writing about eternity tend to develop a particular relationship with time, a sense of the accounting that comes when more road sits behind than ahead. The gospel he had been writing, singing, and building across 6 decades of evangelical Christian music had always carried at its center the same message: that grace exists for the place you have been guarding the longest. What makes the 2019 interview worth sitting with is not the revelation itself and not the tears, but what it points toward. The ongoing, unhurried, unglamorous work of becoming known to the person who already knows you best. Bill's story is not finished, neither is Gloria's, and the room that took 40 years to open is the most honest thing he has ever put on record.